Hi, and welcome to The Horn, a podcast from the International Crisis Group. I'm Alan Boswell. Today, we have Michael Woldemariam back on the show. Michael is a professor at the University of Maryland, and he is a senior fellow at the Center for Security and International Studies there. He's on the show to discuss developments in Ethiopia as well as with its neighbor Eritrea. Michael, welcome back on the show.
Good to be with you, Alan.
So it's been 1 year since this Pretoria agreement ended the war in northern Ethiopia, mostly in Tigray. At the time of this agreement 1 year ago, you had a broad coalition that the federal government had essentially forged and mobilized against the Tigrayans. You had Eritrea involved, you had neighboring Amhara and Afar regions also fighting against Tigray and the TPLF. So, the federal government signs this deal. It surprised, I think, many when it came. But, these other actors, the Eritreans, the Amhara, they were not there at the peace talks. So there was obviously big relief at the time, but there was big questions on, if it would hold. Obviously there was a lot of skepticism that after such a bitter war, the two sides would actually stop fighting. But then I think on the back end of that, there was also concerns that, an end to one war could prove the seeds and roots of future wars. And I think that's kind of the context, we really want to dive into now. You now have fighting in Amhara, which looks like a new war. You have these escalating Ethiopia-Eritrea tensions. Let's go ahead and dive in one by one, and then we'll try to connect all these pieces. So let's start with the situation in Tigray. Obviously, the peace deal did end that war. How safe does it look that peace in Tigray itself will at least continue to hold?
I think, off the top, it is important to note, and you did allude to this, that in many ways, Pretoria and its subsequent arrangements were a success. When this deal was signed in November of 2022, the war in northern Ethiopia was really entering a very dark chapter. Tigrayan defenses had broken down in the northwestern part of Tigray. Some key towns had been occupied, places like Shire, Aksum, and there was a high likelihood, or a real likelihood, that coalition forces were going to retake many of Tigray's urban centers and towns, and that the TDF would flee to the hills and wage sort of asymmetric warfare from that position. In that context, humanitarian conditions for Tigrayan civilians were likely to get much worse than they already were, and they were horrible by that point in the conflict. And so Pretoria effectively stopped that scenario, and the break and fighting has held for the most part. And so, on that level, this is a real success. And, subsequent to that, in implementing Pretoria, the parties did things that were politically very, very difficult for them, right? I mean, the TDF gave up its heavy weapons, allowed for federal troops to enter Mekelle, control federal installations. The federal government, for its part, improved humanitarian access, resumed core public services, took the difficult step up in Ethiopia's parliament, federal parliament, to normalize, re-legalize the TPLF. The two sides agreed on interim administration, and generally, just you think back to the war. I mean, the rhetoric between the parties of the conflict was hot. That acrimonious rhetoric has cooled, I think, almost completely subsided. But I think there are obviously challenges that many observers have pointed to. I think the humanitarian situation in Tigray is really still quite poor. There are recent reports of starvation deaths. As you know, the international community has, particularly the United States, has suspended food assistance to Ethiopia. That's a compounding factor. And there is continuing disagreement between federal authorities and the U.S. government about how exactly to restart that food assistance. DDR in Tigray remains incomplete. You've got thousands, hundreds of thousands of young people still under arms. And now it's worth here, I think, noting that Pretoria's timetable for the disarmament of light weapons was never really realistic. So we shouldn't be surprised. This is still a problem. And then, of course, there's the question of frontiers. I mean, Tigray's western and northern frontiers remain contested, unresolved. There are reports of continuing human rights violations in western Tigray, or Wolkite, in the Tigray-Eritrea borderlands. In these cases perpetrated by Amhara militia, Eritrean forces. These are certainly the allegations. And there's an IDP problem because of the displacement from these areas, a continuing problem. Now, more generally, I mean, you alluded to the coalition that prosecuted the war in the north, the federal government, a variety of Amhara militia forces, and then the Eritrean government. That coalition has fragmented in some notable ways, and we could get into that. But I think a key challenge or continuing challenge for Pretoria has been that this was a multi-sided civil war, and those that fought alongside the federal government had their own particular interests. And two of those parties, Amhara political forces and the Eritreans, were not a party to the Pretoria Agreement, and I think in many ways dissatisfied with it rather. And so there certainly is a potential for renewed conflict between those forces and the Tigrayans, but indeed, again, as you noted earlier, there is conflict between the Amhara and the federal government, or Amhara forces and the federal government, and the potential for conflict between the Eritreans and the federal government, which I wouldn't say necessarily is a likely possibility, but it is a real possibility that needs to be accounted for.
What's your sense of the relationship between the Tigrayan elite, the TPLF, the TDF top people, and Abiy and the federal government right now? Is it still quite testy? Is it something like a very tentative alliance? How would you characterize it?
Yes, I mean, I would characterize it as a tentative alliance. I mean, I think relations, particularly between the interim administration and the federal government, are functional. There are areas of tension that are being worked through, but those areas of tension are real, and I do think separate the two sides. On the Tigrayan side, I mean, I think there are concerns about sort of the slow pace of implementation of Pretoria. They very much tethered themselves to the letter of Pretoria and want, at least their argument is want it implemented in full. And so, for instance, on the issue of the disputed territories, Western Tigray / Wolkite, I mean, I think they have concerns about the federal government's seeming inability to get those territories transferred back to Tigray. The federal government has now recently said that, consistent with the Constitution, their view will proceed with a referendum in those areas. So that I think there is some concern on the Tigrayan side about where that whole situation ends up. Obviously, the humanitarian conditions overall are not great, and I think Tigrayan authorities feel like they could do with more support in that regard. Concerns about, in their view, the positioning of our Eritrean forces in Tigrayan districts in the north, although there's some dispute about where exactly the Eritreans are. And I think a feeling in Tigray is that the federal government perhaps has not worked in a robust fashion to get those forces out of Tigray. Accountability, I think, is another area perhaps where the Tigrayan leadership has some concerns. I mean, they have not been particularly vocal about this issue because they don't want to run afoul of the federal government. But I don't think they were pleased by the disbandment of the ICRI mechanism, which basically internationalized the issue of transitional justice in the Ethiopian context. So I think that is the sort of the view perhaps of the Tigrayan elite. And this is a quick summary. I think there are other things we could put on the table. On the side of the federal government, certainly, they're keeping an eye on disarmament. I mean, they've embraced a very flexible schedule on this, and I think do have some utility see some utility in maintaining a large Tigrayan force, infantry force, both in terms of the law and order needs of Tigray, but also in terms of potentially leveraging that force against other adversaries. Potentially, this is somewhat speculative. But I do think, my sense is that Addis does worry about elements, what they see as elements of the TPLF that are not as cooperative or not willing to be as cooperative with the federal government, which they might view as sort of hardliners of the old guard, and worry about its control, influence over the interim administration and political structures across Tigray writ large. So I think that's an area, again, of concern for them, something they're following. I think with the interim administration itself, and of course its leadership, I think the relationship with the federal government is okay, decent, functional.
Yeah, and so even though this disarmament timeline was in some ways the kind of heart and soul of the Pretoria Agreement, perhaps some mutual interest in not having the disarmament fully take place.
I think that's a key point. I think both sides had an interest in slow rolling the disarmament process. Now, the other piece of this is that, if you're going to do DDR, you actually have to fund it. And there's a real lack of resources, both local resources and resources from the international community to support disarmament, at least thus far, although I think the United States and other parts of the international community have gestured at recently a willingness to support, through resources, a DDR process.
And what did Ethiopia get for signing this deal? Obviously, there was a lot of international pressure. I imagine quite a mix of carrot and sticks. were put in front of Abiy to try to get him to sign this peace deal. Has that worked out, do you think, in the eyes of Abiy and those around him?
Well, I think vis-a-vis threats that they perceived from Tigray, I think it's mostly worked out in the sense that Tigrayan resistance forces agreed to disarm, gave up their heavy weapons, have agreed in principle to disarm their infantry forces and light weapons, and also recognized the legitimacy of Prime Minister, of the ruling party in Addis. I think that in that respect, that was a significant achievement for the Prime Minister and the federal authorities. But I think, of course, and we'll get into this, one of the key challenges is that Pretoria itself, and it's not only because of Pretoria, but Pretoria did seed other conflicts across Ethiopia, particularly vis-a-vis the Amhara and potentially with Eritrea.
Okay, so we've had conflict break out in Amhara between the federal government and Fano forces, defected special forces from the Amhara government, basically forces who previously had been mobilized as part of this war against Tigray, now fighting with the federal government itself. I want to take listeners back a bit before we get into the specifics of now. What was the original relationship between the Amhara elite and Abiy? Why did they support him and why did they join with him to fight the Tigrayans?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of different layers here. I think in some ways you have to go back to the 2018 transition and the months that followed, months and initial years that followed Abiy's rise. And I think it is true that much of the Amhara political class made common cause with Abiy, helped the prime minister consolidate his power in order to contain, corral, and defeat sort of TPLF dominance of Ethiopian state structures. And so the alliance or the support of the prime minister, and of course, when we talk about the Amhara political field, we're talking about an incredibly diverse space, right, in terms of ideological proclivities, in terms of identity. So, I'm simplifying somewhat here, but I think the alliance, I think, was seeded at that time. And certainly if you go back to the internal EPRDF maneuvering that led to the prime minister's election, there was an alliance between, as you well know, Oromo and Amhara political factions. And so there was that, I think, preceding relationship. But certainly in the context of the Tigray conflict, I think one issue that mobilized many Amhara to back the federal government's military effort in Tigray was the territorial dispute or territorial sort of question over, Western Tigray or sort of Wolkai, Humera, a number of areas, and then also disputed territories in the area of Wariye. And so there were territorial, I think, claims made there. But I think, stepping back from this, we have to understand, for the preceding, 3 decades, TPLF had really been sort of the bête noire in Amhara politics. It had been, the source of, at least in terms of perception, the source of the Amhara's sort of overall political marginalization. And so there were these inbuilt historical grievances, I think, that were excavated and mobilized in the moment that the war broke out after November 2022. So now, certainly it's also the case that amongst, again, generalizing here, amongst some Amhara, there is also a desire to reform, to dismantle the system of ethnic federalism that the TPLF and Tigrayan elites, along with others, had helped install in the early 1990s. And I think that was also a layer to this as well. Insofar as it was seen, the war in Tigray was seen as a vehicle for dismantling ethnic federalism.
So how did the Amhara elites respond to this Pretoria peace deal? We've already alluded to the fact they didn't respond well, but how did that play out?
Well, I think there were a couple of concerns that emerge on the Amhara side in and around when the Pretoria Agreement is signed. One argument that is made is that there was not adequate representation of Amhara at the Pretoria talks. Now, of course, there were Amhara representing the federal government that were in the talks, but to the extent that many Amhara felt as if the federal government did not represent their interests, that was seen as inadequate or insufficient. So I think that was one issue. The other was real concern about the territorial question and a feeling that Pretoria might lay the basis for a transfer of these disputed territories back to Tigray, right? So the area of Western Tigray, Wolkai, and so on. And, if you look at the letter of Pretoria, Pretoria basically says that these territorial disputes will be resolved through the Ethiopian constitution, federal constitution, the ethnic federal constitution, the constitution, of course, that many in the Amhara political class take issue with, distrust, and so on. And I think that was another layer. And then the other piece was just, a concern about what, to the extent that Pretoria could translate into a sort of strategic alliance between the TPLF or Tigray more generally and the federal government. I think this was a concern for some of the Amhara political elite. There is another layer to this, which is there had been, certainly in the years leading up to Pretoria and even afterwards, a lot of violence against Amhara civilians in parts of Ethiopia outside of the Amhara region, because the Amhara are a geographically very dispersed group, one of the most dispersed major ethnic groups in Ethiopia. And so there had been a lot of violence against Amhara in southern Ethiopia, in the region of Wariye. And that in some ways had soured Amhara, that had been one of the things that soured Amhara political opinion on the prime minister, because they thought he was not taking the steps necessary to protecting those communities. And there was a way in which this is the view of some. This is not my view, but there was a view that Prosperity Party was increasingly a front for Oromo political interests. And so, you put all that together and you get Pretoria, and you get, of course, there are some real grievances and concerns that come out of that. Now, I could say one other thing, which is that after Pretoria, I think it's earlier this year, maybe April, March of this year, the federal government announces a plan to effectively disarm regional forces and incorporate them into the overall national security architecture. And that really alarms many in the Amhara region. And it alarms them because they're looking at the disarmament process in Tigray and basically saying, well, the Tigrayans are still armed. Why would we be disarmed, right? And of course, from Abi's perspective, the federal government's perspective, they had built up the various Amhara Fano militia during the war in the north. And after that war, I think, had a real interest in sort of reining those militia in. And so disarmament from their perspective made sense, but it created a lot of concern, I think, on the Amhara side.
So how did we lead from this situation up until war, and what is the current situation in Amhara?
Yeah, well, I think the really key inflection point is this decision to disarm regional and militia, which, again, as I recall, I have to check the dates, was really, I think it was March, April of this year. Yes. And that I think is the sort of proximate, that's a trigger point, right, for conflict. The various Amhara militia, which are, we're talking about a very diverse constellation of militia forces. This is not really a coherent thing, but there's a sort of broad rejection of this disarmament plan, and it's that point that we see sort of direct conflict. Although there had been incidents of sort of military altercations between Fano militia and federal forces before. And I think since that time, the conflict in Amhara has proven to be, this is my assessment, has proven to be pretty intractable. In August, you had these various militia forces penetrate some key towns and cities in the Amhara region, places like Gondar, Bahir Dar. And the federal government, I think, has had real difficulty putting down the rebellion. Again, it does seem like, in the absence of some sort of political settlement, an intractable conflict. First of all, the Amhara region is large. There are many people there. It does seem as if the rebellion has a significant degree of public support, from what I can tell, at least among Amhara within the Amhara region. These are well-armed and well-trained militia forces. They had been built up, again, as I noted before, to a significant degree during the war on Tigray, so fairly battle-hardened forces. And of course, the federal government, for its part, is fighting conflicts in other parts of the country, including a very significant security challenge in the Oromo region, particularly Western Oromia in the Wadaaggas. But even beyond it, right? One question is, what is the ceiling of this rebellion? I'm not sure that the rebellion necessarily poses a mortal threat at this juncture to the ruling party in Addis or those who occupy state power in Addis. And there are many reasons for that. One, I think, to pose a challenge to federal authorities in Addis, they would need to build alliances with other militia forces in other parts of the country, and I think that's a continuing challenge from the Amhara perspective. But again, certainly this appears to be an intractable rebellion. There also is the Eritrea side of the equation and speculation about various kinds of support that the Eritrean state might be providing to Amhara forces. But again, that's more speculative, but it's an angle, I think, to be explored.
How much of this do you think was in some ways unavoidable? I think people see, for instance, the Amhara upset at the peace deal and worried that this disputed land, which they seized from the Tigrayans, might go back to the Tigrayans. Meanwhile, the Tigrayans are concerned that it isn't being given back to them. A lot of this looks very zero-sum and almost like a no-win situation. But then, could Abiy have managed this situation better? Was this conflict, did it look inevitable to you?
That's a very tough question, Alan, but it's a good one. I mean, I think Ethiopia, and I've always said this. I mean, Ethiopia's challenges are beyond a single person or a single government. I mean, this is a country at this juncture that is structurally unstable, and certainly it was always going to be very difficult. It will always be very difficult, I think, for the federal government, for the prime minister to kind of strike bargains with multiple constituencies across the country that are ideologically and historically diametrically opposed to one another. So certainly as Abiy pursued peace in Tigray, sought to consolidate that peace through Pretoria, it was going to create a reaction in the Amhara region, right? The federal government is now, as I understand, engaged in talks with the OLA in Tanzania, I believe, Zanzibar. Again, you can confirm that. But that's obviously going to complicate the prospects for political settlement in the Amhara region if the federal government decides to go that route at some juncture. And so I think it's a very difficult situation. Now, I don't think I'd go so far to say as, the Amhara reaction, response, or the conflict in Amhara was sort of an inevitable response of Pretoria. I think there are probably some steps that could have been taken to reassure the Amhara, even as the federal government sought to fully commit to Pretoria. But there's no doubt that reconciling central government policy towards all of these various constituencies, again, that have been historically opposed to one another, have different historical narratives, different visions of what Ethiopia should be in terms of basic structures like federalism, the constitution. It's always going to be very challenging.
Yeah, there's a lot more that we could get into there. And I think it's just worthwhile to just note that Abiy, since he came to power, has now, still faces this rebellion in Oromia. We also hear from those talks, there's a lot of optimism that we could see an overall peace deal there soon. But he had this revolt in Tigray. Now he has this revolt in Amhara. So in very short order, he's faced major sort of insurgencies from, really the three most powerful, politically powerful communities in Ethiopia. And so this sort of turmoil continues.
And Alan, if I could just sort of weigh in with one point, I mean, because I think I've given, some might say I've given a fairly charitable sort of analysis of the predicament the federal government faces vis-a-vis reconciling its policies towards, the various ethnic groups and constituencies across the country. I think some might also say there's a real way in which the federal government, the prime minister, those that occupy state power in Addis benefit from some of the friction, fragmentation, division between Ethiopia's various sort of key ethnic constituencies. So, I mean, that's also something that has to be, in fairness, I think that's something that also has to be put on the table. And some would argue that those that occupy central state authority in Addis are instrumentalizing, weaponizing some of those fissures. We do have to consider that factor as well.
So we'll get back to Ethiopian politics in a second, but how did Isaias respond to the peace deal in Pretoria?
So, I mean, I think we have to disentangle some of their official responses from sort of what they were thinking and saying privately. But I think, overall, there was a great deal of concern in Asmara about Pretoria and the Pretoria arrangement. And I think, one of the issues was that, the Eritrean state, the Eritrean leadership, President Isaias, were quite committed to the TPLF's sort of full defeat and elimination. And to the extent that Pretoria did do this, right, to the extent that Pretoria preserved the TPLF as a political force in Tigray, and I would argue today, still the governing sort of power in Tigray, this alarmed Isaias and sort of explains his opposition to Pretoria. I mean, now, I think, in terms of public rhetoric or sort of public signaling, I think the Eritrean government is saying sort of it's reconciled itself to Pretoria and doesn't oppose Pretoria per se, but they do have concerns about demobilization, of course, the slow demobilization process, because they see this large Tigrayan force as being a threat to them. So I think that that was sort of the overall sort of response or feeling about Pretoria, one of concern, some alarm. There are, of course, reports that they have not fully pulled back from territory, from a number of districts in northern Tigray. Although, this is complicated by the fact that the Eritrea-Tigray border is itself disputed, and so that situation is certainly a bit of a mess. So I think that's a broad response. Now, I think Pretoria did also create some tensions between Abiy and Isaias. Maybe it's too strong to say Isaias regarded Pretoria as a betrayal, but it's certainly not the direction that he wanted to take the conflict in. Certainly was not happy with Abiy. And I think, Isaias gave an interview not long after Pretoria where he basically said that Pretoria had interrupted their military offensives and operations. And so he certainly was not happy with Abiy and the international backers of Pretoria for that reason. And so it's widened, I think, the gap between Addis and Asmara, but it's important to note that the gap had already been widening between Addis and Asmara prior to Pretoria. I think there were tactical and strategic differences about how to prosecute the war in Tigray. The president, I think, has said or implied that he was not happy with the pullout of federal forces from Tigray in the summer of 2021. So, I think there are tensions that had popped up between the two countries or two governments in the course of the Tigray war in terms of how to actually fight the war. As we move on into the post-Pretoria period, of course, I think there are concerns in Addis about the relationship between the Eritrean government and Amhara militia. And then layer on top of that, of course, some of Abiy's discourse around the Red Sea.
Yeah. Last month, the federal government released this recording of a speech made by Abiy, I believe, in June. It was definitely months earlier, but released this recording of Abiy giving a very long speech, basically saying Ethiopia has an imperative to get access to the sea, that it's a power that's too big to be landlocked, essentially. And obviously the neighboring coastal countries haven't received this very well, but how do Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, how did regional capitals really think about this when Abiy sort of made these remarks?
Yeah, well, certainly on the part of Djibouti and Somalia, I mean, there were officials from both countries that came out and rejected these claims or some of the arguments that were being deployed in the video that you reference. They're on record, I think, in that respect, and again are sort of concerned about what they see as the federal government's posturing on this particular question, this issue of sea access. I think the dynamic with Eritrea is a bit different. It's more complex, and I think the concerns in Eritrea are heightened in part because, at one point Eritrea was part of Ethiopia, right? And so when you start making, and Ethiopia had control of Eritrean ports and Asab and Massawa and used it as their own, and so. I think that, when Ethiopia talks about, or the federal government talks about sea access and historic access to the Red Sea specifically, that causes a particular kind of alarm, I would argue, in Eritrean circles. And so, and on top of that, of course, you've got these pre-existing tensions between Addis and Asmara. And again, this is a bit speculative, but, some that have, there was a build-up to the public release of this video on the Red Sea, that government officials in Addis have been privately making arguments about the need for access to the Red Sea, and and at certain junctures might have implied that Eritrea was the most likely or probable case for Ethiopian access to the sea, perhaps Zayla in Somaliland as well, and so. So the point I think I'm making here is I think this discourse around the sea resonated, but was received in a particularly caused a particular concerns and worries on the Eritrean side. And so I think there's a potential for conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia in this domain that it doesn't necessarily apply to Djibouti and Somalia. That's my take, at least. Although we could get into the likelihood of conflict, I don't necessarily think conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia at this juncture is likely, but there's a potential.
We'd been hearing all year, really, that this issue of getting access to the sea, that Abiy did see this as a legacy issue, and this was something that would be, increasingly forthcoming. But what's your sense of the timing of why push this? Obviously there's all this turmoil we've talked about in domestic politics, and the relationship with Eritrea has been rocky. Why make this push now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, of course, we do have to recognize that, partly what the federal government or Prime Minister Abiy is doing is sort of elevating earlier discourses about sort of Ethiopian access to the sea particularly from the imperial era, in the late 1940s, 1950s, when Ethiopia made very similar arguments, in the imperial era in terms of sort of access to the sea, and that paved the way for their control of Eritrea, of course. And indeed, earlier on in his prime ministership, the prime minister had kind of gestured at a Red Sea agenda. This whole idea of building an Ethiopian navy with, perhaps some French assistance. So I think, I say this because, as you indicate, these ideas had been percolating for a long time. It is interesting that they've now been brought to a head at this juncture, that they've been elevated in some way. And there are there are competing explanations. I won't take a position on any of them, but I'll lay some of them out. One is simply, some would argue this is sort of a politics of distraction. And that's not to suggest, of course, that Ethiopia doesn't have real port needs and sea access needs. There are some legitimate issues, I think, undergirding this. But some argue that this is a question of distraction, right? Given in the internal conflicts across the country, the government might be trying to sort of mobilize a nationalist impulse or nationalist sympathies. And more narrowly, some argue that because the idea of Red Sea access has sort of historically resonated, particularly amongst the Amhara, so the older Amhara political class, that the prime minister might be deploying this to sort of bring this community back on side. Now, I think one issue with that explanation is that I don't think it's particularly effective. I don't get the sense that this discourse around the Red Sea is necessarily mobilizing Amhara political support in favorable ways. I don't know if those appeals are really working, if that's the actual ambition. Another explanation might simply be that this might be kind of muscular signaling to Eritrea in the region that Ethiopia, that the prime minister is kind of reasserting himself as a regional force. The feeling might have been Ethiopia over the preceding couple of years had ceded too much regional influence to other countries, perhaps Eritrea, perhaps, even Kenya, and that some of this is kind of signaling, sort of muscular signaling that Ethiopia is in fact a regional player. And a lot of that signaling perhaps might be vis-a-vis Eritrea. So I think that might be another explanation. And then there's just, you could also take, the rhetoric and the prime minister's position at face value and say that, look, they've drawn the conclusion that port access, and I'm not saying this is a correct conclusion, but this is their view that Ethiopia desperately needs port access at the moment. Port access, control or something close to full control of their own port. And are deciding to push it forward at this juncture, particularly in light of some of the overall economic problems that the country is facing. I said earlier that I said that conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia specifically is possible, but not necessarily likely. And I think one of the reasons it's not necessarily likely is that both parties simply can't afford conflict at this juncture. We've already talked about the various internal challenges that the federal government faces across the country, the various nodes of internal resistance across Ethiopia. You would also need, I think, the Tigrayan forces, the large Tigrayan force, to kind of join in a potential fight of that type. And it's not clear to me as yet that Tigrayans would necessarily, or the TPLF, the leadership in Tigray, the interim administration would mobilize behind that effort. I think there's war fatigue. There's also suspicion of the federal government. And on the Eritrean side, Eritrea still is in some ways somewhat isolated internationally, although it's not quite the predicament that they faced back, in the 2010s. Obviously the economy, I think it's fair to say, remains moribund. It's likely the case that Eritrea is still a small country, probably some manpower challenges within the Eritrean Defense Forces, given the sheer number of Eritreans who have left the country over the last 2 decades. And I think overall, there's a feeling that, look, there's probably a lot of risk, an international risk to getting into a fight with a big country like Ethiopia, right? I mean, the last time Eritrea and Ethiopia went to blows in 1998, the long run effect of that was Eritrea ended up getting isolated in the region internationally. Now, the year 2023 is not, the late 1990s or early 2000s, mid 2000s, but I think sort of history is probably informing some of their perspective here as well. And so I think that's my view. So we need to keep an eye on this, obviously. I think a lot of people, in the region, in the international community, are worried about the potential for conflict. But there's a lot of reasons for neither side to engage in open conflict. Of course, there always is the possibility of an inadvertent escalation. And indeed, just because war doesn't make sense in terms of our calculations of the interests of the parties doesn't mean it won't happen. And indeed, when Eritrea and Ethiopia went to war in 1998 over borders and economic issues, my sense is that conflict was mostly inadvertent escalation. No one really anticipated it. No one really wanted it for the most part.
Yeah, most of the conversations I've had with regional officials, diplomats who've been focusing on this, I think most are concerned of the risk of escalation and miscalculation.
The upshot of this, of course, is that the international community is increasingly, Western countries, some countries in the Middle East are increasingly aware of this point of tension. And I think that the hope is that given that awareness, they will sort of take concrete measures to bridge the divide between Addis and Asmara, or regional tensions more broadly. So to the extent that there might be tensions between Addis and Kenya, or Addis and Somalia and Djibouti over some of these Red Sea issues. And indeed, there was a statement from Secretary Blinken, I think last week or the week before, on sort of Ethiopia, sort of the 1-year Pretoria anniversary, where he sort of suggests that implies that we're aware of tensions between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and they need. We need to work. These need to be de-escalated. That nobody benefits from a conflict, and I think that's the message that a lot of international diplomats are certainly sending privately. Now, I think one added layer or challenge here is that Eritrea's relations with the United States, with the West more generally, have not recovered, and so there is a bit of a challenge. I think they can talk to Addis on this issue, although that's not easy, but it's not, they're not necessarily in a position where they can necessarily talk to Asmara. And so in that context, the Gulf countries, I think, are quite important.
Thank you, Michael. As always, thanks for your time. I'll just note to listeners that we didn't dive too much into the history of the Eritrea-Tigray feuding because we spent a very long episode already doing that in the archives, so everyone should go check that out. But thank you, Michael, for coming on.
Good to be with you, Alan.
Thanks for listening. The Horn is a production of the International Crisis Group. Crisis Group has also published a new briefing on the worrying situation in Amhara and how it relates to all these other national and regional dynamics, which you can find on our website. I'm Alan Boswell, and our producers are Mae Francis and Ida Holly Nambi.